So my name is Rachel Stevens. I'm the chapter chair for Vermont as a volunteer. And I just really appreciate you all being here. Before we begin the program, I did want to take a moment to recognize the whirlwind of events that have been going on today. I'm sure, many of us, we've been kind of glued to our for me, it's my computer screen, or maybe the televisions for you. But I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge those events, and certainly recognize that we condemn the violence that we're witnessing in our nation's capital. And it is really tragic to see hatred and political division reach such a fever pitch. But despite those events, we are still really hopeful for what we can do in Vermont and as the nation. And I wanted to cover a few things that maybe got overshadowed by the afternoon. But today, millions of people in my home state of Georgia, I'm from Atlanta, born and raised. They came together and we made history by electing the first Black person ever to the U.S. Senate from a Southern state, which is just a historic event and has never happened. And we also clinched the U.S. Senate majority, which means that we now have a Democratic House, Senate, and now the White House, which I think will just really help us confront the intertwining crises that we're facing with the pandemic, racial injustice, and climate change. And I know things, can't turn on a dime, but I am really hopeful that we can make some progress here. And then, of course, here in Vermont, we have a lot to be grateful for and some historic events that happened today. We elected the first woman of color to the Senate in Vermont today. Well, not elected, but she was sworn into office. And also the first openly transgender legislator was sworn in today, which is really exciting and historic. So I just wanted to mark those events and make sure that we don't let it be overshadowed by the negativity that's going on. And today also marks the opening of the legislative session in Vermont, which we'll talk about today with our speakers and our program. But there's a lot of exciting opportunities for progress that we can make in climate change and other environmental and social justice issues that we care about. So I encourage you to, take a break from the news. We'll let you know if something pressing happens. But just let tonight's gathering be a reminder that there is a power in ourselves and in our community, and that if we can come together, that we actually can make progress. So I'm really hopeful, and I'm so glad to see so many people here. And I just encourage you to stay connected with this community and with your families and friends. And yeah, we're all in this together. So with that, I will turn it over to Steve for our regular program. Thanks.
Right, great. Thank you so much, Rachel. It's important to remember that it's not just a day of craziness, it's a day of celebration too. It's unfortunate that part might get lost a little bit, but and I would even add that we have a historic shift in leadership in the House and Senate in Vermont, with the number of female leaders who are running the show in Montpelier. So with that, it is great to have such a good group here tonight. And this is always a fun time to think about what's coming up in the legislature in this coming session. We've got some of Vermont's great environmental advocates with us tonight. Ben Walsh from VPIRG, Joey Miller from VNRC, and I have to mention Rob Kidd, our Sierra Club advocate, and there are others on the call who get into the State House now and then as well. So it should be a good discussion. And so what we'll do is give our few presenters a chance to share what their top issues are. And if you've got questions, hold on, we'll have plenty of time for that. After they give a brief intro, we'll have a chance for questions and discussion. So with that, I should mention, everybody seems to be on mute right now, which is great. If people can stay on mute until it's their turn. If you want to ask a question, feel free to post it in the chat, or at least say that you've got a question, and we'll monitor that and get around to you when the time comes. So With that, I'd like to pass it off to Ben Walsh from VPIRG.
Thank you so much, Steve. It is a real pleasure to be here tonight. I actually am a former executive committee member of the Vermont Sierra Club years ago, but served with Steve, and I know how much the Sierra Club can get done. It is a real pleasure to be able to work with Rob and the whole Sierra Club team in our work on climate here in Vermont. So again, my name is Ben Edgerly Walsh. I run VPIRG's Climate and Energy program. I also oversee our work on racial justice. I've worked with Rob and Joey, who's also on the call, and you'll be hearing from in a moment, for many years. It's been amazing to see how far the climate movement has come nationally and internationally, and also right here in Vermont. I did want to just say a couple of words, not about things that are happening in DC right now. I really appreciate Rachel covering that, but about what happened last night in Georgia. Obviously has implications for what is going to be happening in DC, what is possible under a Biden administration, and that could have really significant implications for what's possible here in Vermont. That is incredibly encouraging. But what we also saw, as was just discussed, when you organize your ass off for a really long time, you can make big things happen that people don't think are possible. And that's exactly the sort of work that climate organizers and activists like the folks here on this call have been doing. That's why we saw the Global Warming Solutions Act pass. That's why we saw it happen despite the governor's veto last year. And it's why we're going to ultimately be successful in hitting our climate targets here in Vermont. So I want to talk a little bit about what VPIRG is prioritizing this coming legislative session. We obviously work very closely with the Sierra Club, the NRC, and a whole host of other groups. So there's a 31-member coalition that is behind a broad climate agenda. And so when I say VPIRG's priorities, these are our priorities. They're also things that a lot of other groups are doing really fantastic work on. And I want to recognize Rob in particular for his leadership on transportation issues the past several years. They've been getting short shrift for too long, and that's something that's really going to change this year, which is really exciting. So I'm going to touch on a couple of things on climate. I want to hit on a few other environmental issues that VPIRG is working on just very briefly. These are not issues that I am an expert on, but they're issues that VPIRG is going to be working on and certainly overlap with a lot of the interests I imagine folks on this call have. And they're obviously incredibly important in their own right. So I'll touch on those, and then I'll turn it over to Joey, who's going to talk a little bit about the legislative session, if there are gaps that I leave, but is also going to be talking about the Vermont Climate Council, because there is a ton of incredibly important work happening right now at the Climate Council that is not actually quote unquote in the State House, virtually or otherwise. So without further ado, VPIRG's top priority on climate this legislative session is going to be advancing modern climate-friendly infrastructure in the transportation sector. That is something that's long overdue. It's something that that we've sort of as a state been chipping around the edges of for a few years now. But when you look at the greenhouse gas emissions, the carbon pollution that we're putting out as a state, the biggest chunk comes from transportation. Lord knows there's a lot of work to do on buildings and weatherization, and we need to be building a lot more renewable electricity right here in Vermont. But the biggest chunk definitively comes from transportation. And so there's a lot of work to do there. And the really fantastic news is, in this moment of economic crisis brought on by COVID, there are just this vast array of modern transportation infrastructure investments that we can be making as a state that will cut the costs for Vermonters in every corner of the state. So we're going to be working on policies that cut carbon pollution and cut Vermonters' costs at the same time. And that is exactly the sort of thing that we should be doing right now as we are trying to build back better from this economic crisis that we found ourselves in. So I'm not going to get into too much detail here. I'll hit on a couple of examples of things that are going to be, we're going to be supporting. next week, just a little bit of a plug here. You should definitely tune back in. I believe same time, maybe not the same link, look for a new link, but definitely look for the webinar that Rob is going to be doing specifically on transportation. He's going to be diving into a lot more detail on these things. But there's a whole host of things that we've already done as a state. We've invested in electric vehicle charging, fast chargers, as well as level 2 chargers. We've started to deploy electric buses, school buses, and transit buses. We've got low and moderate income incentive on electric vehicles. We've got the Mileage Smart program that provides incentives for Vermonters who are lower income to get into high fuel efficiency used vehicles, electric or just high mileage gas vehicles. There right now is fare-free public transit, partly because of the pandemic. There is a microtransit pilot that just started here in Montpelier, where I'm sitting right now. That is an innovative model that really should be built on. So that's not an exhaustive list, but the point is there are a lot of really good ideas. There are a lot of things we know how to do and we could do tomorrow if we just reprioritize some of the investments we're already making in transportation. And of course, the hope is that with a blue Senate and a Biden administration, there is going to be a more forward-looking approach to infrastructure and perhaps more opportunities for Vermont because of that. But whether that happens or not, there are a lot of things that we can do within the existing budget and the existing structure here in Vermont. Oh, and Rob just dropped in the chat. Definitely save that link so that you can tune in next week to hear more on that. Let me touch on a few other things on climate. These are not things that we necessarily expect to move in the next few months. There's going to be a real focus on COVID recovery appropriately in this legislative session. It's also being done entirely virtually, at least for the first several months, potentially for the whole session. And that just means that everything takes more time. You've all been on Zoom before. It is not the very most conducive to efficient meetings. So there are going to be a number of things that are on sort of a 2-year track that we are building a foundation for this year, and then expanding that in 2022. So this is not an exhaustive list again, but 100% renewable electricity with far more renewables here in Vermont, dramatic expansion of weatherization, investments here, of modernizing Vermont's efficiency work and really doubling down, tripling down on electrification, allowing Efficiency Vermont to do more work in that space. And of course, the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which is a regional initiative that would put a cap on the carbon pollution coming from the transportation sector, and the revenue generated by that cap would be reinvested. In our mind, the really critical thing there is making sure that's an equitable program that really lifts up all Vermonters in all corners of the state and doesn't leave anyone behind. And that is entirely doable as long as we are thoughtful about how we adopt and implement that program. So those are things that we expect the Climate Council to really dig into. I'm not going to spoil any more surprises of what Joey's going to say. The last thing that I'll mention on climate, and this is very, very much last but not least, we do expect there to be legislation introduced on environmental justice. That's not something we've been involved in the inception of, but it is something that we are excited to dive into and support if and when it is introduced. And then just 3 last things that I want to mention as far as VPIRG's work that is a little bit outside the climate arena, although certainly related. One, we have been really working to reduce Vermont's contribution to the plastic pollution crisis. That's something that we're going to be continuing to push for this year, expanding on our work there, expanding the Vermont's bottle bill, really modernizing it. And then working to reduce Vermonters' exposure to PFAS, which of course is a classification of chemicals that are dangerous for a whole load of reasons, not the least of which is they make people's immune system more vulnerable to things like COVID. So those are issues we've been working on for a while now, and we will continue to push for this coming legislative session. There's a whole lot of work that VPIRG does that has nothing to do with sort of quote unquote traditional environmental issues. I'm not going to get into all that. It's a long list, but we just posted a legislative preview that's comprehensive on our website. So I'll drop a link in the chat, but it's just vpirg.org. It's the first thing you'll see on the homepage. So if you're interested in other things that we're working on, do check that out. So I really appreciate you taking the time to tune into this. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Joey Miller from VNRC. Thanks, Rob. I appreciate the links there. Joey is a fantastic climate advocate, leads the Vermont Energy and Climate Action Network, and it's a real pleasure to be able to work with her on these issues.
A lot. We work together a lot. Anyway, thank you, Ben. Thank you, Sierra Club team. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Thanks for the opportunity to connect with you. It's kind of a crazy, crazy day. Glimmers of hope, and then, you know, there's a lot to take in this moment. So, and I appreciate what Ben just laid out. We work together a lot, largely in coalition with Sierra Club, with VPIRG and many others in the 31-member Climate Action Coalition that Ben just mentioned. I guess I'm going to try and be brief because I'd really love to hear from folks, but I would just say, you know, VNRC, we're a statewide environmental education and advocacy organization. We've been around since 1963, and we work on a lot of different environmental issues. I run the energy and climate program there, and we, in this moment, are recognizing, obviously, the very challenging reality that we are in. And as our legislators returned to the important work that they do today, also recognizing that it's going to be as Ben noted, and as we are all aware, a likely virtual legislative session. So I think that has pretty significant implications for what is possible to unpack in this moment and what our legislators are rightly prioritizing. So I see Representative Carrie Dolan on this call. I really look forward to hearing from her about her priorities as a member of the Natural Resources Committee in the House. But I would say that, you know, just stepping back, you know, VNRC, we work on toxic issues and water issues and forest and wildlife issues, sustainable communities, land use issues, and then the energy and climate program that I run. So our legislative agenda this year, informed by a lot of the coalition work that we do with several of you on this call, I think we are in the moment of being nimble and being also responsive to the reality that legislators are rightly focused on the COVID-19 pandemic and the need to respond to the imminent moment that Vermonters are facing. And I think what it means for our legislative agenda, Ben articulated a lot of the sort of legislative issues, what we are likely to be partnering with VPIRG, Sierra Club, and others on. But for us, looking forward at the legislative landscape this year, a big piece of that work is going to be focused on the budget. Obviously, in this moment, the state's budget is challenged, and we are looking to use existing revenues through the transportation bill and through that program, for example, to make sure that we are putting those dollars to work well for Vermonters, and also potentially repurposing existing revenues to support, looking towards a 21st century transportation system. I would also say that we will be tracking the budget closely because of the fact that we want to make sure that as the state grapples with a lot of really important priorities, that the environment doesn't get short shrift. We really want to be protecting, clean air, clean water, a healthy food system and healthy lands for Vermonters. So we're really looking closely at the budget. We, as you probably know, have worked for a long time, actually, since essentially our inception in 1963 to help co-create the Act 250 land use and development law that that was a big initiative, and Representative Dolan can speak more to that. It's an obviously important tool that has done a lot to essentially create the Vermont that we know and love. And there's opportunities for improvement, and that is an issue that the legislature dug into deeply last year, and many elements of that have not been resolved. So Act 250 reform and improvement is likely to be on the table in some way again this year. But what I really actually wanted to say, considering the fact that as the legislature reconvened today and people took their seats, a whole new leadership team, a whole new slew of legislators, as this new biennium gets underway, under the weight of the pandemic that we are all facing in so many different ways, I think it's just going to be it really is refocusing how we are thinking about our priorities. And I would say for me, my work, and for VNRC, we're really looking forward to staying tuned in to how the legislature is orienting itself in this moment. Looking forward to building back better as potential new federal stimulus dollars come in. Side note on that, as people, I hope, have seen, the new stimulus bill has re-upped the investment tax credit for solar, for example. We now will have ongoing support to deploy renewables through the investment tax credit, which is important. So we'll also be staying tuned into what the federal government does to deploy more dollars into the state to make sure that those dollars are stretching as far as they can to not only serve the most vulnerable Vermonters and help us rebuild out of this pandemic in a more sustainable and equitable way, but to make sure that they go towards, towards solutions that really look towards the future and not double down on, sort of business as usual. I guess what I want to say, lastly, and really open it up for questions, because I really want to hear from you all about what you're thinking about. And this is a big partnership. VNRC, we are really committed to collaboration and coalitions. We are partnered with the Vermont Conservation Voters, so we work on sort of electoral issues. I helped coordinate the statewide network of town energy committees. These local grassroots groups play a very important role in Vermont's energy and climate action efforts. We work collaboratively under the Transportation for Vermonters umbrella, looking at how do we, support and help to spur a more diverse transportation system that prioritizes moving people and goods as opposed to just moving cars. And we do a lot of that work in coalition. So I'm looking at this conversation with you all as really important information and fact-finding for me in terms of our policy advocacy work and our work at the local level. And then also just to pivot to a big priority for many of us, including many of you, has been to stand up the new Climate Council and the Global Warming Solutions Act, which has turned our long-standing climate goals into requirements. And that, after the successful override of the gubernatorial veto in September, that work is underway. There is now a 23-member Climate Council that is focused on making sure that Vermont is doing its part and on the climate crisis and making progress towards reducing our emissions in a way that really focuses on adaptation, mitigation, resilience building, and ensures that we're leaving no one behind. It's a pretty nascent effort. I am one of the appointed members of that Climate Council. It's a 23-member council. Many of you probably know that. 8 secretaries and commissioners and 15 other appointees from the House and Senate who bring a really important perspective to the table. It is not a council that represents everyone in the state of Vermont yet, which is also one of the reasons I really want to hear from you. But again, it's a nascent effort. And at our next meeting on January 25th, I encourage as many folks who are interested and able to attend. I think we're going to really dig into some of the meat of how we're going to sort of operationalize this big endeavor and think through this initiative and effort in a way that focuses in the adaptation, resilience, and mitigation sectors in a very creative, inclusive, but implementation and action-oriented way. So we have a lot of work to do in that arena. Many of you helped to bring that initiative into fruition. And I think it's going to take a lot of collective effort to help ensure that it succeeds. And again, very nascent. And I don't want to repeat anything that maybe you have heard in the past, but one of the big focuses of the January 25th meeting is to look at and think about, I think, the creation of the 4 subcommittees that have been legally required under the statute. And those include Just Transitions, Mitigation Subcommittee, and 2 other subcommittees that look at resilience and adaptation and the role of our natural assets, including our farms and forests, in the transition. So it's a lot of very important work, and it's going to require the partnership of folks like you, all of us, to ensure that it succeeds. So I really want to pivot towards, hearing from many of you, and I'm wondering if, Steve, you might facilitate some sort of Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we jump into that, I want to pass the mic over to Representative Carrie Dolan, who's here, to see if she has something that she'd like to add to this discussion.
Thank you, Steve. And I really am participating, certainly as a member of the Sierra Club, but also I'm here to listen. As you know, I'm entering my 2nd biennium at the House, and I've been assigned to where my heart lies, in the Natural Resources Fish and Wildlife Committee. And I want to be accessible to you all and listen to you and hear what your priorities are. I look to your expertise, your perspective, because I know that you're looking out for Vermonters' future. And I share that passion, those concerns, and I'm here to make those important changes that we identify happen. I appreciate hearing thus far the input from both VPIRG and VNRC. The priorities you've talked about thus far are my priorities. I see climate as critically important. As you may know, I am now chairing the working group for the Climate Solutions Caucus, focusing on resilience. And I see that as having multifacets in its work. It will certainly be looking for the ongoing effort to mitigate the impacts from flooding, which is probably our most common natural disaster that we currently are experiencing. But I also see the important role of our forests for forest sequestration, for forest health, forest soils, agricultural soils. Sequestration is a part of this mix on us addressing our climate footprint. And yet we see that our numbers in terms of sequestration are going down, going in the wrong direction, partly because of the fragmentation of our forests. And so looking at forest health and what we can do there is a priority. And looking at nature-based solutions in addition to forests to help us build a more climate resilient future. Part of this climate resilience will also look at community resilience. How do we, if we are interested in trying to increase pedestrian or bicycle travel, how do we make that happen where you have smart growth principles in action to support our rural communities, the vibrancy of those communities, and the importance of having those communities embrace their opportunities for improved pedestrian and bike-friendly types of development. We also, I heard Ben mention about PFAS, which is what they call the forever chemicals. We're not quite there yet in having a commercialization of some of the bacteria that they found that can potentially be used to address contamination. But what we have discovered is that source reduction is the cheapest opportunity for us to address the contaminations that we have. It's incredibly expensive to clean up areas, groundwater, surface water, drinking water contaminated with these chemicals. And I'm very interested in continuing that work to eliminate the very sources that are causing and contributing to our PFAS legacy. Plastics pollution as well is another priority you mentioned, and where and how we can address plastic pollution, recycling, looking at the bottle bill are all important parts of our role in doing our part to reduce plastic pollution in the environment. I think Joey mentioned Act 250 updates, and yes, that was something that we've been as a committee working on for the past 6 years or so. We didn't quite get it over the finish line with the governor's veto last year, and it really, quite frankly, didn't fully contain some of the enhancements we were looking for. And we envision being back at talking about Act 250 updates so that we can best be prepared to address the needs that we described in terms of forest health, working landscape, and concentrated development. We are the natural resources, fish and wildlife. So obviously the fish and wildlife part is a priority for us. And we're very interested to see to the extent to which the Agency of Natural Resources is best prepared through their fish and wildlife and natural resource management to address today and tomorrow's concerns, whether it be increased invasive species, both on the terrestrial or the insect varieties that are degrading our landscapes, or whether it's about appropriate management for rare and endangered species, especially as our habitats are under stress from a changing climate. And Ben had also mentioned about environmental justice. And as you may know, when I'm not at the legislature, I'm at the Agency of Natural Resources, and I have been working on environmental justice there at the Department of Environmental Conservation. And I haven't seen the governor's proposal for legislation, but I understand that that is in the works, and very interested to know what that entails. I certainly embrace the state's efforts to ensure that we have an environmentally just society, and what do we need to accommodate? What do we need to do to accommodate that is a priority for us as well. So thank you for this opportunity to, again, although I just took up a bit of your time, I appreciate me participating, and really me being here to hear of what your priorities are. So thank you for this opportunity.
Well, thank you. It's great to hear that there's, there are so many things happening at any given time in the legislature on these issues. So it's good to hear that the Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife Committee is going to be taking up a lot of those. I wanted to take just a quick minute to mention a couple of other things. I know Rob is going to be working a lot on transportation issues on behalf of the Sierra Club. A couple of things that we are also doing in the energy field. One issue that's been on our list for quite a long time has been a concern about the myth that we think our energy, our electricity is so clean, and it's only clean if you ignore the carbon emissions and other impacts of the electricity we get from Hydro-Quebec, and between carbon emissions from large hydro, from biomass, from fugitive methane, there are some big gaps in how we count carbon in our electricity. And it really makes our electricity not a whole lot better than, say, just plain old natural gas. So that's something that we're looking at ways to address that through legislation, and also certainly through the Climate Council, which has one of its big tasks to review that, exactly how we account for carbon emissions. So that's one of the things that we'll be following. The other thing I just mentioned really briefly is that we are pulling together a team among our members, among many people who have been part of these community conversations and other interested people that have raised their hands over the last year or two to follow the Global Warming Solutions Act and the subcommittees and the goals of, an important part of that act is to establish these subcommittees and to establish, just the whole notion of a climate council is really different than having a top-down approach to solving this problem. And we know it can't work that way. And it's really, the bottom-up approach is what it's going to require. So we are hopeful to pull together a team of people who follow different strands of the work, of the massive work of the Climate Council. So I would invite anybody to ask or to send an email to find out more about that work. And I won't say anything more about that because I think it's time to open it up. So as I said, if you have questions, I'm going to see. I'm going to take a quick scan here and go to my gallery view so I can see. If you want to just mention in the chat here, let's see. Rachel, I see that you have a question.
Yes, my question was answered. I had asked if there was a draft of the environmental justice legislation, and Rob has informed me that it has not been introduced yet, but I should mention that in my day job, I work at the Environmental Justice Law Clinic at Vermont Law School. So I'm very interested in that topic. And yeah, so that was my question and I just answered it. Rob sent me an individual message. So thanks. Okay. Unless there's anything else anyone wants to say about that.
All right. I see that in the chat here, John H has a couple of questions, but if you could go one at a time. I also see James got your hand up. We'll get to you next. John.
One basic question I had is, given the failure of any aid to state and local governments, we're basically going to be dealing with very straitened circumstances, and we have to do a lot of fiscal repair and pretty disastrous cutbacks. So how does that impact any kind of environmental planning or progress that we could make? Because basically we have to fund things one way or the other. And funding, basically, the state has a balanced budget requirement, and when the economy goes south and when taxes go south, we're dependent on the federal government to make good, and they haven't done it as yet, and I'm not optimistic. So how does that impact what we can actually do? The other question, I'll just get it in edgewise, is there's been talk about Act 250 reform, and there was a blistering letter protesting in the Brattleboro reformer, and I just didn't get, I want to hear the other side of what exactly are you thinking about in terms of updating Act 250 and so on and so forth. You can answer separately both questions.
Well, you want to take, Ben, Joey, somebody want to take the money question first?
I can take a stab at that one first. I certainly can't speak to the other one. That's not an issue that we work on more than just a teeny bit. So on the situation that you put forward is absolutely accurate. I will say a couple of things as to federal legislation. So one, the recent stimulus bill that was passed over the holidays definitely has money for Vermont, and it's not in the form of sort of straight up aid to state and local governments to plug budget holes caused by this crisis. Obviously, that was not something McConnell was willing to go along with, but it does have money that's going to be flowing to the states. And my understanding is the Joint Fiscal Office of the legislature is still trying to unpack all the details of that. And some of it will be helpful in plugging sort of budget holes, even if it was not necessarily intended that way by DC. So the hope is that as those details are uncovered, especially in the transportation sector, it looks like that there actually is going to be some assistance from the federal government. The second thing I'd say on federal legislation is, obviously after last night, I am much more optimistic that there might be an additional stimulus. Actually, I'd be shocked if there weren't an additional stimulus of some kind, with the Democrats having control, if by the slimmest possible margins, in the US Senate. And certainly that side of the aisle has been much more interested in actually assisting people on the ground in state and local governments, whereas, McConnell in that leadership role had literally told governments to go bankrupt. So different kind of perspective. And then as far as, what the budget looks like here in Vermont, the Appropriations Committee has just been reformed in both bodies, so I don't want to speculate too much. I will say there are incredibly capable legislators on both sides of, both floors. You would say, if we were actually in the physical state house, but in the Senate and the House, that have years and years of experience in making the kinds of hard decisions that they are going to have to make. So I don't want to make light by any remote stretch of the fiscal straits that we're going to find ourselves in, but I also don't want to pretend like this is the first time this has happened to Vermont or these particular leaders. They are very capable of doing that. Beyond that, we're going to be watching to make sure that critical climate and energy and environmental programs aren't cut. Things like, low-income weatherization, Efficiency Vermont's work. Democrat, Republican, there's always, always this sort of sense of, oh, well, maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room in terms of these programs. Maybe we can, find some way to stretch the dollars a little bit further to cover other things that aren't actually their mission. And that's something that we've always been able to stop from happening. And I certainly have no information to suggest it will happen this year, but it's something that we are always watchful for and, work closely together to make sure that nothing like that is in the offing. Can someone else tackle the second half of the question?
Well, before Joey, you posted something there. Is that about?
I guess I think Ben well encapsulated the reality, and I would defer to Representative Dolan too on this question, but I just shared with you sort of an overview from the legislature's joint fiscal office about sort of the economic relief and the stimulus package, and kind of a preliminary fiscal overview of what the state is dealing with, in case people are interested or want to dig in a little bit further. But I think, the reality is this is not, as we all know, normal time, and it's, the economic impacts of what we're wrestling with are significant, and it's having an impact on what the legislature is able to lift, certainly virtually and in general. So I just wanted to share that with you all in case it was helpful context and you hadn't seen it yet. And John, I think my experience, you ask such good questions. And on the Act 250 question, even though my organization, we live and breathe and we were sort of like birthed through Act 250, I would say I'm going to defer to Representative Dolan on what might be possible again in this moment in the sort of the virtual legislative session, in terms of like how targeted Act 250 reform might be, what that might look like. So I don't know if Representative Dolan, you might want to tackle that better than I.
Yes, and to your first question about budgets, that is something we're going to, as a committee, dive into, probably in a more deliberate way for the first month, to better have the new committee members better understand the roles and responsibilities of the agency natural resources and see how that ties to the budget. And that may help to identify where there's redundancy, where there's opportunities for repurposing, dollars. The agency's been terrific at using this lean approach, which is a business improvement model, to find where there's redundancies, to streamline processes. But we're hoping to dive a little bit into that, so that we are making sure, obviously, that every dollar counts and is making a difference. But there's an important question you raise. With respect to Act 250 updates, I want to stress that it's really an update, not a reform. Act 250, I think, has been hugely successful over the past 50 years. And what it is, interestingly enough, the most modified piece of legislation we have in the books, as I understand. There have been more modifications around the edges of Act 250 over time than any other kind of general legislation. But being 50 years old, there are, I think, opportunities for enhancement. It came before Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, for example, and certainly before we really got our arms around, or now that we're getting our arms around, climate impacts. How can we look at Act 250 criteria through that lens, for example? So what happened, COVID really, even though we passed out of the House a comprehensive update that looked at all those across the board, from criteria to standards to environmental justice to land use planning, really to protect our forest blocks, our working landscapes, and then allow greater development in our designated downtown areas. What came out of the Senate because of COVID was a much reduced package. They really only tackled 2 of the whole set of opportunities for enhancement. And I think that's the governor, I heard through the grapevine that the governor wasn't necessarily against what was passed out of the Senate. They just was hoping that we would do more as a legislature to look at enhancements. What we're really interested in, bottom line, is to make sure Act 250 works for our lands, for our natural landscape, our habitats, our wildlife, and our people that live here, and that working landscape concept, for example. So we're it is all about that process. How can Act 250 work better than what it is currently? I want to make one note that oftentimes Act 250 gets blamed for delays in permitting, for example, when it may be an agency of natural resources permit that is holding up a project. And so there's some education that needs to go along too. But I think largely Vermont and its green hills are as lovely, and fundamentally that is largely to do with Act 250. And we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But we do want it to make sure that it is ready and able to take on the challenges that we're faced today, which is, as I mentioned, the fragmentation of our forests, where we're losing the forest benefit. And we all want that forest benefit. If 70% of our landscape is privately owned, fragmenting our forests means there's less forest for trails, less forest for logging, less forest for just enjoying our birds and our wildlife, our hunting uses, our wildlife viewing uses. Our intrinsic value of having fragmented forest. And so it's, I think that's still a major priority for us, to make sure that we are doing our part to really safeguard these important and finite natural resources.
Great. Thank you for that. Rob, you had something to add about the finances?
Yeah, I want to add something about the budget part. And one thing we talk about is with transportation issues, which we're going to dive into very deeply next week on transportation discussion. The transportation budget is a huge part of the budget in Vermont. And the transportation funds are not as impacted as badly as they were predicting. The numbers I've been seeing, I'm not sure that all the details, but we can easily just shift some of the existing revenues into our programs that are going to help the client, so they're consistent with our values and our goals, not just counterproductive. So we can shift our $60 million maintenance budget toward transportation work. So that's one of the things we can go into it without even really fully creating new money. We can actually use existing money. So look at that discussion next week with Mike McCarthy, and then we'll have some others, and we'll talk more in detail about that.
And the
That's it.
pre-registration link is in the chat already, I think. So we have a question from James, or a point, James Maroney. James, glad to have you here. You're on mute.
Thank you, Steve. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
I've joined tonight because I want to encourage VPIRG and Sierra Club to move agriculture and the pollution that agriculture in Vermont creates a little higher in their outreach. Depending upon who you talk to and how you measure it, I suppose conventional agriculture is the second largest generator of greenhouse gases worldwide, behind only electrical and heat generation, and ahead of the entire transportation sector. Now, in Vermont, that might be a little different, but the point is interesting in Vermont because for two reasons. Vermont has a conventional dairy industry, and the dairy industry has convinced the legislature and most people, for that matter, into believing that they have either tackled the problem or that they're working very, very hard to solve the problem of lake pollution and atmospheric pollution. The fact of the matter is, according to the Lake Champlain State of the Report from 2018, they say, and I quote, from 1990 to 2018, most segments of the lake did not show long-term trends in phosphorus concentration. That means no improvement for 30 years. That's 30 years and $3 billion that the taxpayers have given to the legislature in order to quote unquote save agriculture and protect the lake. And what we have to show for this is zero. So when Suzanne Zelliff and Carl Buchholz ask questions about agriculture and what we're doing about it, I want you both to know that I have the House and Senate Agriculture committees in Montpelier are deeply invested in promulgating the status quo. I've never heard any discussion in either of those two committees about joining the 21st century. And by that, I mean converting the dairy industry to organic. If the state of Vermont converted its dairy industry to organic, we would cut lake pollution and probably atmospheric pollution in half. That is not just that the portion coming from agriculture would be cut in half, and we could do this in 3 years. But so far, I have virtually nothing to show for 25 years of advocacy on this point. So whenever you think that Act 64, the so-called Clean Water Act, has tackled that problem, Act 64 skirts that problem brilliantly by not really mentioning it. And I just want everybody to know that, and I'm urging the Sierra Club and VPIRG to pay a little more attention to what conventional dairy does in that regard to our atmosphere and our water.
I think Joey's going to feel left out. Yeah, I think, James, we've talked about this before, and what I would say, one aspect of this is that while there are a lot of great reasons to go with organic, regenerative, to use Carl's term, there's a lot of great stuff out there and with a lot of benefits. I think people might be reluctant to force, to use the force of government to get people out of conventional ag. I think that's one of the toughest.
Well, if they want to pay,
things.
if they're at the present time, the people are paying $135 million. That's $370,000 a day for no progress. So the idea that the government is not telling people what to do. We tell them to drive on the right, do we not? We tell them they have to go to school. We tell them a whole lot of things they have to do. farming conventionally is not important in Vermont. And in fact, the dairy industry is losing 100 million a year in operations, 100 million a year farming conventionally. And the taxpayers are basically backfilling that activity.
Let me see if Carl or Suzanne had anything to add to that, and then we'll get to Joey. Carl, you and Suzanne, you both
Yeah,
made comments. Suzanne?
I do actually. I was thinking mainly of, and I was actually typing it right now, it has nothing to do with organic or conventional. Like you can go around the state between the 1st of December, the 15th of April, people spread manure at that in ban. Think about the in-ground ship pits, the pool lagoons, whatever the proper word for them are called. Every year they're supposed to be inspected for leaks. Are they really? It's a huge endeavor. I have personally heard agricultural inspectors say, nah, it's too much of a hassle. Or what do people do during the winter and they don't have the proper place to store that fecal matter? Like, these are huge. And as water quality is going up, and as water quantity is going down due to global warming, these are things I'm just terrified the next few years, based on what I have seen in river sampling, that E. coli levels are going to be so high and the water is going to be so low that water areas are going to be shut off for recreation. And it seems like there's just such a good old boys club, to use that term, in the ag department, who just like, it's okay. It's okay. How's the missus? How are the grandkids? Blah, blah, blah. Until it's going to be so egregious that there's no turning back. And it has nothing to do with organic or conventional. Like, there are some good laws in place. They're just not being enacted. That's it.
Thank you, Suzanne. Carl, did you want to add to that? You mentioned some things about regenerative ag.
Well, just I got into the regenerative agriculture issue through the Drawdown book edited by Paul Hawken. A few of us here on a group called Earth Matters. We are a 350 node in Manchester, Vermont. So we've been studying this, and I guess I just, reiterate what has been said. If regenerative practices are put into effect, by definition, you really can't be putting poisons on the soil in the form of pesticides. And it seems to me that if you follow their practices, you're going to clean up Lake Champlain, because you're not going to have the same volume of runoff into the water system. And you're going to have soil that can hold more water, so it wouldn't run off in the downpours that we've been getting lately. So it just seems like an area that is ripe to address. And it seems to me one of the biggest problems would be the dairy industry lobbying against any more regulations. So that's my comment.
We did a couple of these events, our community conversations about about soils in particular and agriculture in general, that are worth checking out. Joey, you had your hand up there.
And just two things I would say to add off to the rich conversation. I would just say the points you're raising about regenerative ag, I think, are really important. That, like, there's such an intersectionality of so many of these issues, and we really need to think about and really look to and work hard to really focus on the opportunities in deepening our commitment to a local, like, regenerative ag food system. And there's so much innovative work here and happening, but we need to do more. And just two things I would say is just to underscore what I had said before, is that it's not the panacea, but the climate council that's getting stood up. There is a subcommittee that they're going to put together on agriculture and ecosystems services. I think lifting up some of the things that you're talking about, that it's all connected into that venue, so we can really focus on the solutions and the sort of build off of all of the good work and good thinking that is already happening. I just want to sort of put that out there again, because I think, you know, for my work, I would just say personally, I have not done as much as I have begun to do lately and need to do more of, is really look at in terms of as an energy issue, as a climate issue, the intersectionality of like a more local regenerative food system. And I think there's all kinds of potential there. And then I would just also say, I'm going to drop into the chat here. Rachel noted that it was the first day of a virtual new legislative session. There's a new cohort of young of incoming legislators, a lot of whom are, I think, really committed to the issues. They ran on the issues that we're talking about. I guess one thing I would say before we peel out, and I don't mean to get the last word, but or whatever, is just to say, reach out to your new legislators, reach out to your legislators in this moment as they're doing a lot of things. I would just say it's important to build relationship, and that, you know, they're obviously focusing on a lot of things right now, but there are new committees that were comprised today.
All right. Great. Well, thank you so much for that. Ben, did you want to have any last words also as we close in on the end of the hour?
No, just a real appreciation for, again, you know, being invited to do this. I also I was gonna make a very similar point to the one Joey did. If folks didn't catch it, I dropped in the chat a link to the Global Warming Solutions Act as passed, along with the section there that describes the subcommittee that Joey was talking about. So if folks want to see what they are legally tasked with, they can check that out there. And then, you know, we hope and expect the subcommittees of that to start to actually be created over the course of the next month. So I think there's a link higher up in the chat as well about the Climate Council. If you just Google Vermont Climate Council, it'll pop up and you can find the details for their upcoming meetings.
Steve, can I jump in?
As I mentioned,
quickly?
we are pulling together a team that's gonna work together to follow different aspects of that, including this one. So, Rachel?
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate what Steve mentioned about our community conversations, or, you know, any of our speaker series. So James, and I would invite you, if, you know, we have had several discussions on agriculture and alternatives, but if you have a specific topic in mind, I'd be glad to work with you to put together a program and maybe invite some speakers and devote a conversation to this. So I put the past conversations in the chat, which you can look at those recordings of past sessions. We've done one on organic and water quality and things like that, but just want to mention that. And I see Representative Dolan has her hand up.
Yes, Representative Dolan.
Thank you. I neglected to mention one other priority for us that I know we're all probably, our heads are spinning with this discussion, but I think it's been a terrific discussion. But one of my concerns is that we may not have in place effective protections for our water resources if new infrastructure that propose, say, movement or pipelines for large projects that would have it go through wetlands or under lakes or streams. I don't know that we have the protections in place with our state water quality standards to ensure that we are minimizing those impacts. So I wanted to just flag that for those that have mentioned their concerns about water quality. That is my background. It's an area that I'm very passionate about, and will be doing everything I can to ensure a level playing field, and we have the protections in place to ensure that any large project that's being proposed through Vermont will minimize or avoid any of those impacts to our natural resources.
Great, important work. Well, thanks to Joey Miller, Ben Edgerly Walsh, for joining us tonight, and we look forward to welcoming you back at other times, and hope that the upcoming session works out really well for you guys, and that the Global Warming Solutions Act and Climate Council is a series of home runs for you, Joey.
For us.
And again, I welcome all of you to follow up if you want to help us follow those issues. So thanks so much.
And just to give the final plug for next week, we'll talk
yes,
more about
there
the
we go.
transportation issues and the climate, related to climate issues with Representative Mike McCarthy and Senator Andy Perchlik. So that will go into much more detail about the transportation issues. There's so many areas that we knew we couldn't get down into that detail. So please join us for that one. Go to our website and you can register or share the chat already. So thank you all for this wonderful conversation.